Okay, now we're going to continue our work started in the last two videos. And we're actually going to take this technique of completing the square, of taking a binomial and completing the square to make it a perfect square trinomial. We're going to use that technique to now solve a quadratic equation. So solve for x. So in the previous two videos, if you notice, we just put it in the right form. We completed the square and left everything with a binomial squared, right? But now in this video, we're actually going to solve for x. Okay, so here's our first example. We've got x squared minus 6x minus 16 equals 0. And next to it, I've written some, actually written out the steps that you're going to want to use in order to complete the square to solve this quadratic equation. Okay, so the first thing is we've been checking. We've always been sure before we actually take our half of b that a is 1, right? So we're still going to keep checking that. So we're going to look at our original quadratic and we're going to check to make sure that a equals 1. If a is not 1, then we're going to do some division. So that you're going to see examples of that later, okay? But a is 1 here. So now we're going to do something a little bit different. Notice this time we have an equation. We actually have an equal sign. We have two sides of the equation. So that negative 16 here, we want to use the x squared minus 6x to complete the square, but that constant is kind of in the way. So we're actually going to move the constant by adding it to the other side of the equation. So we're going to write x squared minus 6x, leave some room, equals positive 16. Okay, so we added a 16 to move the negative 16 over to the other side of the equation. Okay, and now we're going to complete the square. We're going to look at the left side. And so again, a is 1. We already checked that. B is negative 6. Half of b is negative 3. And then we're going to square that. And that's going to be 9. Okay, so that's the step that we call completing the square when we do all that. And so we're going to add a plus 9 here. Now, here's the thing. Because we have an equation, if we add a 9 to one side, we have to add it to the other side. When we complete the square, when we find this, when we take b and divide it by 2, and then square it, and we get that new number, it's going to get added to both sides of the equation. Okay? All right, then we're going to factor on the left. So that's x minus 3 squared equals, over here we have 25. Okay, so now this should look familiar because we did some earlier work on square root property. And do you remember that in square root property, we always had quantity squared equals number? And boom, isn't that what we have here? So we are now going to use the square root property. Okay, and then what are we going to remember when we use square root property? If you said plus or minus on the right hand side, you're absolutely right. Okay, so we're going to take square root of this guy, but over here we're going to write plus or minus square root of 25. So here we have x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 25, so plus or minus 5. So now we have to solve two equations. The first equation is x minus 3 equals 5, or x minus 3 equals negative 5. Add 3 to both sides, and here we get x equals 8. And we're going to add 3 to both sides here, and we get x equals negative 2. And it says to check. Okay. 8 squared minus 6 times 8 plus minus 16. I'm back in the original equation, did you notice? And I'm substituting the 8. So that's what? 64 minus 48 minus 16. This is a negative 64, and so that does equal 0, so that checks. And here, negative 2 squared minus 6 times negative 2 minus 16. So this is 4 plus 12 minus 16, and it's 16 minus 16, so that equals 0, so that checks. Okay, remember you can use your calculator to check as well. Okay, so here's a question for you. See if you remember. What kind of roots are these? What kind of solutions? What kind of numbers? And when we got x equals -2 or x equals 8, so those are, those are our two solutions, -2 and 8. And if you recognize those as rational roots, rational solutions, two rational solutions, then you're absolutely right. Beautiful. Okay, let's go through this whole process again with another example. Okay, number 2, we have x squared plus 16x plus 63 equals 0. Okay, step 1. Check for a. A equals 1. Check. Okay. Step 2. Move the constant. We want the binomial, the first two terms, we want them on their own side of the equal sign so that we can fill in the square, right? So I'm going to write x squared plus 16x plus something equals, and then we're going to subtract 63 here, right? To move it over, subtract 63, which is -63. And we're remembering that if we're going to add something to the left side of the equation, we got to add it to the right side to keep it all even, right? Okay, so now we're going to do step 3, which is the complete the square. Complete the square step. So b is 16, right? Half of b is 8. Squared is 64. Add it to both sides of the equation. Let's use a different color. 64 here and 64 there. Whatever we do to one side, we do to the other side. Beautiful. Step 4, factor. Factor. X plus 8 squared equals, and then add these two. So -63 plus 64 is 1. Okay. Step 5, square root prop. Square root property. Take the square root of both sides, and what are we going to remember on the right hand side? Yes, if you said plus or minus, you're right. Okay, so square root, we need a different color. Square root plus or minus square root of 1. So here we get x plus 8 equals plus or minus 1. Solve two equations. Step 6, solve two equations. X plus 8 equals 1, or x plus 8 equals -1. Subtract 8. X equals -7, or x equals -9. I'm going to leave the check to you this time. Okay. Solution is -7 and -9, those two numbers. What kind of numbers are those? If you said rational, you're absolutely right. Two rational solutions. Excellent. Let's go up to the box so that we can go over those steps again. Okay. So here are the steps for solving a quadratic equation in standard form. You see it? There's our standard form quadratic by completing the square. The first step is going to be divide by 8 to make the coefficient of x squared term 1. So we haven't had an example yet where our a hasn't started out as 1. Okay? But we will. So the first step is always to check your a. Second step is to move the constant. Get those two terms on one side of the equation and then extra constant to the right side. Third step is to complete the square, taking half of b and squaring it, but this time not to forget that you have to add it to both sides of the equation. The fourth step is to factor the perfect square trinomial that you just completed. You just completed the square, so you should have a binomial squared. Okay, that's called factor. All right, then you're going to use the square root property remembering the plus or minus. Okay. You're going to simplify the radical. When you do the square root property, we've done that work before. And then you're going to solve the two resulting equations. So you're going to have two equations to solve. And then always a good idea to check your solutions. Use your calculator. Okay, let's do some more. We'll do one more in this video, and then I'll do another video for more examples. Okay, so here's the next one. X squared minus 10x minus 4 equals 0. What does A equal? It's 1. Cool. We checked. We need to check always. Okay. Move the constant. So leave those two terms on the left. Leave some room. Equals. And then add this 4. So positive 4. And then you don't really need that little plus sign. I don't know why I put it there. But notice that I'm already setting up that I'm going to add something to both sides of the equation, right? And what am I going to add? Whatever makes this a square. This is the complete the square. So B is negative 10. Half of that is negative 5. Squared is 25. 25 goes here. Different color. And here. Okay. So this 25 goes both sides of the equation. All right, cool. Now we're going to factor. X minus 5 squared equals, add the like terms over here, so we have 29. Those two constants, right? Okay. Square root property. Square root plus or minus, don't forget that. Oh gosh, my students, they tend to forget the plus or minus. So train yourselves, plus or minus. Okay. Now, we got to solve these two equations. So we have x minus 5 equals square root of 29, or x minus 5 equals negative square root of 29. Add the 5. And we get these two. What kind of numbers are these? Do you recognize them? These are irrational roots. You see them? We've got non-perfect squares under the radical, so those are irrational roots like pi, right? Okay, to check these, you want to use your Stoke. And I showed you how to do that in the last video, right? Okay, so your two solutions are 5 plus root 29 and 5 minus square root of 29. These are exact answers. And your homework may want you to get both the exact answers, the exact roots, along with decimal approximations. So check your instructions. Okay, go to the next video.